now in the studio to help explain some of the reasons behind the veto and further expand upon the situation in Syria is Taufiq Rahim, a Dubai-based political analyst and the director of Global Site. Welcome to the show this evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to begin by focusing on just why Russia and China did veto the Security Council resolution. Is it just because of their military relationship with Syria, or were there some other motivations involved as well?
Well, I think Russia and China both felt burned in the original Libya resolution, which called for intervention with the underline of by all means necessary. And I think they're quite wary of what type of resolution has been put forth with regards to Syria that explicitly calls for a political transition. Russia and China traditionally in the United Nations have safeguarded very much the concept of sovereignty. And while they're able to emphasize issues of peace and security that have a regional or international nature, interfering in the domestic affairs of a country has always been a red line for those two nations.
Absolutely. And looking at the resolution, or rather a potential reworked resolution going forward, I mean, do you think this is something that Russia and China might be able to come to terms with, to get behind, or is it an issue that if we're looking at something like regime change, leadership change, that's something they're never going to agree to?
I think under the current circumstances and for the foreseeable future, regime change is simply out of the question for China and Russia to support. If you go back to the summer of last year, I was in New York and I met with some diplomatic missions there. They were negotiating the previous resolution that was vetoed, but with very much the same language, and they decided to put forward a resolution without Russia and China's overall input at the end. And I think in the next few days or few weeks, unless the resolution is altered in its substance, I think you'll see the same result, which is a veto. And what that means is that a new resolution would have to call for an end to hostilities, a political process, but not necessarily a political transition.
Now, of course, all of this does take time. What do you think is the best way to stop the bloodshed in Syria?
Well, I think it's an extremely complicated situation, and there are no clear answers. It's been deteriorating every day. As we know, there's more deaths, and it's come to a situation where the Assad regime has ultimately lost legitimacy and probably cannot stay in power, but yet at the same time you have to remove it from power. And how do you do that politically or militarily and through what process? And that's really the question. And that's the danger in front of Syria today. While it's very easy to condemn Bashar al Assad, and many human rights groups are doing that, what really is the worry for most people, including many Syrians, is how he actually leaves the scene. And that requires really a concerted effort of dialogue, of keeping all avenues open, because once you start to close avenues, even avenues where he can perhaps go into exile, then you have a situation where he fights to the death, which obviously can be much more bloody than the current situation even now.
Absolutely. Now, you yourself, Taufiq, spent some time in Syria. You actually met President Bashar al Assad. What were your impressions of the man? I mean, do you think he's someone who's willing to compromise in this way? I mean, you mentioned, for example, potential exile, other options going forward. And do you think it really, all the onus lies with him, or is it a matter of the regime as a whole and not really him as an individual?
Well, there has always been the thought that, especially when he first came to power, early in the last decade, that he was part of a wider, regime apparatus. But I think in recent years, he's really taken control, and I think that's been seen throughout this crisis. He's been leading with many of his speeches and appearances, and so while he may have a team, let's say, of people around him, he's very much at the forefront. And in terms of when I did have the chance to meet with him as part of a delegation from Harvard, we did sit with him, and we did have the chance to see his perspective of situations even in Hama in 1982, the massacre there. I think the impression you get is this is a very stubborn individual. If you tell Bashar al Assad to walk in this direction, and he's already walking in that direction, he might turn around and walk in the opposite direction. He's very sensitive to external pressures. He has a path in his mind. He feels it's a rational path. He feels he's doing the right thing, even when everybody tells him he isn't. And I think that's the man we're seeing at the leadership right now in Syria.
So how do you communicate with someone like that?
It's extremely difficult. I think you have to use the right people to communicate with him. I don't think it's a situation where he's going to come around and say, I now support a pure democratic transition in the country. I do think it's going to be a case where he has to see there are two options. We're going to facilitate this other option for you. It's not going to be involving, let's say, international intervention in Syria, and hope that he accedes to that. And I think for that to happen, you do need to have Russia and China on board. If you don't, then you're going to a situation where you force him either to abdicate or be arrested or be killed, which, of course, as I mentioned, would be very disastrous for the country.
What do you think will happen after he does eventually leave? Do you think the people of Syria are really ready to form a new government? Of course, we saw in the case of Libya, there were problems with the Transitional Council for quite some time, but even so, they did have a long time to put something together. This has sort of been happening. Obviously, there's been a lot of killings there and violence on the streets for some time, but if they're really ready to form a new government, the question remains.
Well, I think, the day after scenario is really far from us. I think we need to focus on the transition because when you get to the day after, it's a really different situation than Libya, where they're also facing problems, which we don't need to necessarily discuss right now. But the Syrian National Council does not have the same presence that the National Transitional Council did. The NTC in Libya had a home in Benghazi, a staging ground, so to speak. They were getting international support gradually. They were getting a number of high-profile defections that bolstered their ranks from both the military and political and, of course, diplomatic wings of the Libyan regime. Whereas in this case, the SNC, or Syrian National Council, is not even under the same umbrella, so to speak, as other opposition groups like the National Coordination Committees and the local coordination committees. And so you have a situation where you have a fragmented opposition that has not been able to attract a number of high-profile defections until now, does not have a staging ground where it's forming its presence yet. And so I think it'd be very difficult to make a seamless or even a somewhat seamless transition in Syria. So we're in for a very difficult time ahead.
Absolutely. Well, Taufiq, thank you very much for joining us, and it absolutely looks like a lot of work left to be done in Syria, and obviously we hope for the best. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.